So I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Naomi Eisenstadt. She was the first director of the Sure Start unit, which was responsible for delivering the government's commitment to free nursery education places for all 3 and 4-year-olds. The government's National Childcare Strategy and Sure Start or major programmes aimed at reducing the gap in outcomes between children living in disadvantaged areas and the wider child population. Naomi is currently the chair of the Northamptonshire Health and Care Partnership and a trustee of 2 charities, the Standard Life Foundation and the Education Endowment Foundation. She was awarded an honorary doctorate from the Open University in 2002 and 3 years later became a Companion of the Bath. Naomi is going to kick off the discussion today by providing an outline of the context and thinking about the role of early years, both in children's development and also in their wider development. She'll also be talking about the role of the state in facilitating access to these services and support for families, especially for the most disadvantaged communities. So Naomi, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, and thank you very much for inviting me. I suppose when I have this audience, I always like to tell you that I started my life in Britain as a nursery assistant in a social services day nursery, that my experience of early years is very much from the front line, and then worked my way up through voluntary organizations and into the civil service to run Sure Start. So can I have the first slide, please? So what I really want to start with in terms of the context is that, what do we think the role of government should be or is in family life with young children? Because early years educational care is part of what government does, but it does a lot of other things as well. And Carrie Oppenheim and I argued in a book quite recently that the government has 2 main roles. One is to reduce pressures on families, and the other is to enhance capabilities. And you reduce pressures by a universal free health service, by rights and legal protection, by maternity, paternity leave, but also by flexible working and flexible childcare and targeted benefits. Enhancing capabilities goes towards parents, of course, information and guidance, skills and training, before and after birth, midwife support, but also nursery education is part of enhancing capabilities in children. And enhancing capabilities in parents are things like family nurse partnerships. Obviously, the government has a major role in intervening to safeguard children. Can I have the next slide, please? So what has research told us that's informed policy development on early years? Well, 3 things matter the most: family income, quality early education for all children, but the most difference for the poorest children, and the home learning environment. And we know of those 3, the most important in child outcomes is the home learning environment. But we also know that family income is very, very important, both in terms of direct access to funds, but also in terms of the kind of stress that lack of money puts on families that makes it harder to do the things that we know good parents should do in providing a good home learning environment. But quality early education will mitigate the impact of poverty. It will not entirely eliminate it, but it is a very important piece of the puzzle in terms of what creates a difference for children. And the EPSI results, the Oxford project, now goes right through to 16-year-olds, where they're still finding an impact on both social and cognitive outcomes for children who experienced high quality early education. So next slide, please. So what's important? School readiness for cognitive gains, but also social and emotional development. And social and emotional development comes through warm family environment, consistency in parenting behaviors, and good relationships between the parents. And as I say, money matters. Money matters. It's been really obvious in terms of the pandemic, even for the youngest children, that money matters in terms of access to safe outdoor play space. It matters in terms of the kind of IT gear you have in the house. It matters in terms of the kind of employment parents have, which meant that they were able to work at home or not. So all these things make early education and care really important and make a big difference for children and families. Next slide, please. But I would argue that the government's aims in providing early education and care have been kind of mixed, and also aims that are in tension with each other. So one of the aims has been to reduce poverty, by enabling workforce participation by mothers. This was a major feature within the Blair government, and flexible childcare, usually provided by the private and voluntary sector, made it enabled mainly lone mothers, where the poverty levels dropped enormously. It was a huge difference for lone mothers to be able to work because benefits kept up and were increased, so that actually working made you less poor. Now we're in a position where the majority of children living in poverty actually live in a household where at least one parent is working. The second aim was to reduce the chances of poor children becoming poor adults by providing high quality education. And that was in the EPSI work, early education based on half-day school patterns, including holidays, and usually school-based. So the original model saw childcare as completely separate from early education, and early education very much school-based, and importantly, almost always qualified teacher-led. And that's a key feature in quality, is teacher-led in early education. And the third aim is to reduce chances of becoming poor children becoming poor adults by providing integrated family support. So what are now called family hubs, what we call Sure Start Children's Centers, are where families living in poor areas can get access to a wide range of services that support parenting, but also support wider aims for the parents, largely mothers, of course. Next slide, please. So how has the policy landscape changed? Well, all parties are still emphasizing the problems of affordability of childcare, but I would say there's been a distinctive lack of attention to quality of early education, and that the main expansion of childcare has been about employment. It has not been about early education. The impact of poverty is challenged by government, but the government emphasized much more parent behaviors, not their circumstances. I would argue that it is parents' circumstances that largely dictate their behaviors in terms of their abilities to provide the kind of home learning environment we know provides the best outcomes for children. And benefit changes have increased pressures on families. The pupil premium is not enough to level the playing field, and we know that the pupil premium is particularly low in the early years, and that the 2-year-old offer has not been sufficient quality to make the kind of difference that led to the 2-year-old offer being made. Right before this talk, I attended a talk with Kathy Silva, and she was saying how epi evidence really drove the 2-year-old offer, because they found that children who started between 2 and 3 were doing better than children who started after 3, and again, particularly poor children. But the nature of that offer was a much higher quality offer in terms of the work that epi did. So I would argue that the 2-year-old offer is currently not of sufficient quality. And the payment for the 2-year-old offer, and indeed for the wider childcare offer when government says 30 hours free, is not enough. Next slide, please. So what should we be asking for? Well, I've been arguing throughout these few slides is that I don't think that we have a workforce that is up to the task. This is not the fault of the workforce. This is very much the fault of the requirement for a fully qualified workforce within a set period of years. And I don't mean that everybody has to be QTS. I mean that within a class of children, there should be at least one QTS, and that QTS, that qualified teacher, should be in the classroom with the teacher, with the children, not just in a managerial role. Because what we found in the research on quality is that childcare workers with lower qualifications did a lot of modeling when there was a teacher in the classroom. Supply side funding should be contingent on improved qualifications of staff. So that means that if government is paying, they should pay more if we have better qualified staff. We need better links across schools with the private and voluntary sector providers and with health. Again, EPI found that the highest quality was to be found in maintained schools, less in the private and voluntary sector. But again, a lot of that was about the wages paid to the private and voluntary sector were lower, and that you didn't have the regularity of attendance within the PVI sector that you tended to get in schools. In the PVI sector, it's much more common for children to come 2 or 3 days a week if the mother is working part-time. In schools, it tends to be five days a week. I do think children's centers are really important. I mean, now with the Andrea Ledson report, she's calling them family hubs. Quite frankly, I don't care what you call them, but They need to be fully funded in poor areas with access to both targeted and open access services. And I would argue very strongly that open access is really, really important when you combine services, because it is the open access services that draw in the families who are just on the cusp, who with a little bit of help could really benefit without, raising the bar into high need families. I would also argue that those centers that only offer targeted services are much more likely to attract stigma in terms of the users of those services. You have a problem, you're not a good enough parent. And that isn't a good way to encourage the kinds of behaviors that we think work. Finally, and I think this is a really interesting thing about what's happened in in English policy, but it's true in the other 3 nations, there's been almost no attention to provision for families with under 2s. And that's again where family hubs and the work that Andrew Leadsom is doing is so good, because it talks very, very strongly about the importance of parenting in those very, very early years before we start formal nursery education. So I think that there's a range of things that government can and should do, but they all come with a pretty heavy price tag. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Naomi, for providing such a comprehensive overview of early years policy and best practice, and particularly the longer term view you were able to share with us. Now moving from a macro look at the sector to a more micro view, our next speaker is Zara Simpson, who is a deputy head teacher at ArkTalks John Archer. She has 16 years of experience as an early education teacher, leader, and vice principal. She supported the Oak National Academy in spring 2020, teaching virtual maths lessons to foundation age children across thousands of homes in England. And Zara will be discussing the work at ArkStart and how it seeks to answer the challenges of the early years sector for families, and what more is needed to ensure all children have the best start in life. So Zara, over to you.
Thank you. Hello everyone. So my name is Zara Simpson. I'm a deputy head teacher at ArkStart and lead the provision here at ArkStart John Archer in Battersea. As Camilla mentioned earlier, I have over 16 years experience of working with young children in positions that range from being a nursery nurse, an early years teacher, an early years leader, and a vice principal. A few years ago, I was asked whether I'd be interested in joining a brand new venture here at ArkStart, whereby its primary focus would be about providing the youngest children in our society with the right start to their early years education and equip them with the knowledge, skills, and experience needed to have a great start to their primary school journey. And as such, ArkStart has a wonderful curriculum that is language rich and provides children with opportunities to ask and answer questions such as how, what, and why. It also provides children with opportunities that they may not otherwise have had, and provides them with opportunities that inspire them and develop those all-important characteristics of effective learning. An example of this is last month when we were hatching ducklings in the nursery. The awe and wonder shown by the children was absolutely amazing, and the language that was developed from that experience was fantastic. They were speaking in full sentences, and it was absolute joy to see. Most importantly, ArkStart is about establishing a provision which prioritises not just the direct teaching of children, but also seeks to work with families and parents in our community. Our first ArkStart, which is ArkStart John Archer, opened last year in October 2020 in the middle of a global pandemic. We started off with a small cohort of children as parents and families were carefully considering whether or not they wanted to send their children to a nursery provision. This can be seen as a challenging time to open a nursery and grow a cohort. However, it was an ideal opportunity for myself and the ArkStart team to show our commitment and determination to working with and supporting families in our local community. Part of our commitment to families includes regular dialogue with them on a daily basis about the progress and welfare and development and well-being of their children. We also offer a peer parenting programme called EPEC, which is run by parents for parents and offers to support them and give them daily tips on the day-to-day methods of raising children. We've also recently launched another parent programme in partnership with Citizens UK that aims to build parent confidence and enables them to come together to make changes in their local community. This year has served to reiterate to me that family work is probably one of the most important aspects of my role at ArkStart. I've seen firsthand over the years the positive impact that strong parental involvement has on the support and development of young children, and this cannot be underestimated. It can be challenging. Over the years, I've witnessed lack of engagement for parents whereby they haven't turned up for meetings or workshops or other events. And I know that this can be difficult, especially for working parents or those that have become disengaged from education themselves. However, something that I believe could be beneficial in improving parental engagement is being personable and showing an understanding of the factors that sort of prohibit a good level of parental engagement in the first place. And working well with this understanding is important too. In the same way that we treat children as individuals, we must also treat the families and the parents and carers as individuals too. We follow up emails and sort of communications with direct communications and phone calls to ensure that parents who struggle with whole group dialogue feel that they are important and that they are communicated well with. We also make sure that we have an important sort of dialogue with them on a day-to-day basis if they miss out on any meetings, to make sure that they are kept fully informed. For example, when we started recruiting for our parent group called EPEC, the sign-up was basically non-existent. Parents were very disengaged and felt that their contributions weren't going to be received well. However, with direct conversations with them about how their knowledge and their experience would be beneficial to others, the sign-up increased, and now we are successfully running our first sort of parent group program today at ArkStart John Archer. I've also witnessed the impact of the parenting program at ArkStart, where parent group leaders reported how the course provided valuable support to them and their children during a tough period during lockdown, refocusing the importance and the value of their roles as parents and supporting them with parenting tips and guidance. This again highlights the positive role that a setting such as ArkStart can play in the lives of families. I strongly believe that a strong focus on family work is something that needs to be consistent across the early years sector. A well-structured and purposeful approach towards working with families and other external agencies to ensure that children have access to the right level of support needed to flourish. And I hope that as we look ahead to the future, that policymakers and politicians prioritise this in their thinking. So in essence, a nursery education is about so much more than childcare. It takes a village to raise a child, and at ArkStart, we work with our staff and with our families in making the village stronger every day. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Zara, for giving us such a fascinating insight into the work that ArkStart are doing. And now moving on to our final speaker before we launch into our discussion of some of the issues. Felicity Gillespie is the director of Kindred Squared, a charitable foundation which works with partner organisations to improve early education and early child development. She's been an advisor to public and private sector organisations for over 2 decades, working with FTSE 100 businesses and ministers and officials across Labour, Coalition and the Conservative administrations. She's a former associate of the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit and of the National College of School Leadership, and has served as a national judge of the UK National Training Awards. Felicity will be discussing the current challenges in early years and how the sector has responded and what else might be done. Felicity, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. I should start by saying that we are not experts in the early years at Kindred. Our interest lies more in seeking to build the public awareness of why the early years matter. I've only got five minutes, so I'm going to just whiz through a few ideas which maybe we can pick up in the discussion. But I think the first thing I observe about this phase of education, but in education generally, is that we do spend a lot of time talking to ourselves. There are facts that are commonplace to us within the sector that the rest of the world simply don't know. So we all know, for instance, that most of the brain is developed before you start to talk, that the brain doubles in size in the first year of life, that our developmental progress at 22 months serves as an accurate predictor of educational attainment at 26. We know that, and we know that if you're behind at 5 in your vocabulary development, that you're 4 times more likely to have reading difficulties later, you're 3 times more likely to have mental health issues, you're twice as likely to be unemployed. We know this, But we partnered with the Royal Foundation a couple of years ago on a major piece of social research into the public's knowledge and views about the early years. And what we discovered is that whilst we all know this, most voters and taxpayers don't. We also know that the current proportions of government spending on the different phases of education are frankly a bit bonkers, given what I've just said about the early years being developmentally where the action really is, and where we get, without doubt, the biggest bang for our taxpayer buck. I don't want to get too technical, and I haven't got slides, but this is as good as it gets. Here we have, this is public spending on education. And the one on the left, you don't need to see the numbers, it doesn't really matter, it's the proportions. This one is secondary education, this one is primary education, and this tiddly little mere speck is early years spend. So in spite of the fact that we know that for every £1 we invest in high quality childcare pre-5, the state saves £13 later on in terms of healthcare and mental health and prisons and unemployment and so on. That's what we're dealing with at the moment. We also know that whilst the early years is not the only point of key neuroplasticity in the brain's development, that the sort of spongy point where we're most flexible and developing fastest, we know that there is another key point of neuroplasticity in adolescence, but that it costs much more and it's much harder to achieve the kind of impact in adolescence that we can have in early years. And that's before you even consider the human cost of starting and being behind your peers right through childhood into adolescence. So to get the impact that we get in early years for £1, in adolescence, it costs £7. We can do it, but why wait? It costs more and it's so much harder. The Royal Foundation latest launch of the Centre for Early Childhood a couple of weeks ago also announced that it's over 16 billion is what it's costing us to have lost opportunities in the early years as a nation, and that's every year. That's 5 times what we're spending in England on early education and childcare entitlements, and that's probably an underestimate. So even if we tripled the spending of our little bit here, even if this went up by 3 times, we would still be saving money, we'd still be much better off by a number of billions. So given that that's all the case, given that we all know that, it's not a secret, no one's hiding it, the question is, why are we still continuing in the model that we currently have? Why, as a society, do we undervalue and under-nurture the early years so significantly? Why aren't we all up in arms about the fact that local authority budgets have been cut by 45% in the last 10 years, or that a person developmentally responsible for a 6-year-old needs a degree and QTS, but somebody responsible for a 4-year-old only needs 2 A-levels? It's just sort of insane. So why are we not all talking about this? The government continues to spread responsibility for funding and policy making across 14 government departments and NDPBs, making any kind of joining up and sensible sharing of data and information across that early first phase of development almost impossible. Why is that happening? The early years sector is just critically fragmented, and it's just really hard to get that sort of development going through in a systemic way. And it's also very hard for families as a result to access the help they need at the point where they really need it. There's lots of unhappiness. It's interesting in society. There's lots of unhappiness about the fact that Kevin Collins only got 1.7 billion, not the 15 billion for COVID catch-up for children that he clearly and rightly said was required. But what's more interesting to me is the fact that the 1.7 billion only started at 5. So all those problems that we're seeing as a result of COVID in the under 5s are just being stored up because we're not intervening, we're not doing catch up. But again, as a nation, we're not talking about it. We're not saying this is mad. And that's surely got to be something that we need to be thinking about. There's a sort of mass ignorance about the basics of human development, and consequently it's accepted as the norm that education starts at 5, and that's what we need to be concerned about. In spite of children spending over 10 years in state education, they emerge still without even the most basic grasp of what effective parenting looks like. We don't give them the information, and governments are very squeamish to talk about family policy or parenting for fear of being branded a nanny state, which is odd, given that there's no squeamishness about imposing the will of the state on family life from 5. It's called state education. We all accept it, and if we don't comply, we go to jail. But before 5, somehow it's not something that we can really talk about openly, about the need to intervene in a way that Naomi talked about, particularly in the under twos, in that first critical phase of development. So I think what I'm trying to say is that I don't think we need to be talking about, you know, should we have another percentage point or 2 percentage points or X percent or X thousand in the CSR this year. What we need to be doing is changing completely the nature of the conversation about how we as a society, as taxpayers, because it affects us all, we're all going to pay the £13 that we're going to have to spend if we're not spending the pound in the early years to put the problems off. How are we all going to change that conversation and prioritise the development of our young people at a point where it really, really matters the most? So as voters, we need, how do we start to demand from our politicians, and it's not just this government, it's every government, they all need to be re-evaluating this, so that it's not just Key Stage 2 SATs and GCSE grades that we care about and we report publicly, but that the number of children entering school who are developmentally not ready to be there, which at the moment, by the way, the government doesn't even measure, how do we make that something that as a society we all really care about? We funded YouGov to do a survey of schools last year on this, and we think it's about 35%. So it's about 1 in 3 children are entering school not ready, and that's just a sort of criminal waste of human potential, as well as being expensive. So we need the big change. I mean, there's a few things that we're thinking in the short term we really need to be thinking about. One of them is Oxford University is developing some curriculum materials for Key Stage 3 science, so that as well as learning about muscles and digestive systems, you also learn about brain development in an appropriate way. There's also something around getting a cross-party consensus about the importance of the early years, and the Early Years Commission, which has been run by the CSJ and the Fabians and co-chaired by Tory and Labour MPs, is reporting next week, which I think is great. Irrespective, frankly, of what they recommend, the fact that there is going to be a cross-party consensus maybe will be the start of getting us beyond the sort of 5-year political cycle towards a more long-term and strategic conversation about the importance of the early years. And then, of course, we've got the Duchess of Cambridge's new Centre for the Early Childhood, which I think is a brilliant way of elevating this again beyond party politics, beyond a 5-year cycle, to something that's big and that's public and that's an ongoing conversation. So I guess we can talk endlessly about the various strands of activities, but I think it's that fundamental shift that is what's needed, and a conversation beyond ourselves that's where we really want to be moving the debate a bit. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Felicity, for that really interesting sort of broadening the discussion out to brain development and human nature and all these really quite fundamental things. So I'd now like to invite all the panelists to join me in a discussion about some of the issues that we've heard so far. My first question is something that Zara mentioned about parental engagement. Clearly, this is something that's really important when children are at such a young age, and also when the home environment counts for so much as well. So Naomi and Felicity, I'd like to ask your thoughts on this. What successful policies or what could be done to kind of improve the parental engagement side of things with the early years sector?
Okay, I'll kick it off because that was a very, very strong feature of Sure Start. And one of the things that we found really worked was at a very micro level, you know, at neighborhood level, finding out what mothers, first of all, I'd rather use mothers and fathers because it's almost always mothers. And this is a very gendered debate. And it's very, very important that we don't wind up again dumping everything on women. So what happens is that the push for parental involvement winds up being one more responsibility for mothers. And it's very important to engage fathers as well. So that's just a sort of side comment. In terms of what worked is that when we set up a program, we asked, did you speak to local parents on what they wanted? And if they came back and said, oh, yes, we did. They said they wanted more speech therapists and more health visitors. We knew that they spoke to speech therapists and health visitors, because the plans that came back and said, yes, we spoke to local parents, and what they wanted was the dog dirt cleaned off the park, the graffiti cleaned up, the broken glass cleaned up. What they wanted was improvements to their physical environment. Now, it's very, very hard for early years settings to do that. But what I'm trying to explain is that the things that we want parents to want, very often they don't want. And unless we figure out what they do want and try to have some negotiation between what you want and what I think your child needs in a very open and transparent way, it will always be patronizing and unhelpful. So my key message is not what do I want a parent to know, but what does that parent want out of this service and how do I facilitate that, and then take it from there to what I think the parent needs.
Fantastic. And Felicity, do you have any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really critical question, isn't it? I mean, the research that was done last year into a big study into parenting, I think showed that it is the case that basically every parent, bar a tiny minority, all parents really want the best for their children. They want their children to thrive. They want them to do at least as well as they've done, if not better. They want the best for their children. I think what is a key issue is that some of them don't know what that looks like, and some of them don't have the wherewithal, the circumstances to be able to get the help they need when they need it. And I think critically, going to Naomi's point earlier about the need to really focus on the parents that need the support early and quickly and that are struggling, I think is the question about how they access that support. That the point about family hubs is that it's great to have a place for people to go to get help, but there are some parents that need the help to come to them because they either don't have the confidence to go and look for the help, they don't know that they need the help, and I think therefore the health visitor function is absolutely critical. That, you know, the government recognizes this. They've mandated 5 face-to-face visits with a health visitor in the first 2 years, but what we know is that increasingly those visits, those face-to-face contacts are not face-to-face, they're happening by letter, by phone, and that actually that critical relationship where someone comes into your home and is able to just build a relationship and see what's going on and see where the help is needed, and then refer the family at a really early stage before the problems become entrenched and really difficult. I think that is very important. So I think the role of the health visitor and how we support that is really important.
Thank you very much. And one other question before we move on to our Q&A with the audience. I wanted to ask the panelists' thoughts on, I suppose, specifically where we're at now. Coming out of the pandemic, there's perhaps an opportunity to press the government on rethinking early years or refunding it. We've already had some of the catch-up funding aimed specifically at early years. So clearly there might be a bit of interest from the government in doing something here. I wondered what you think, what opportunities you think this kind of post-pandemic reshaping could have for the early years sector.
If I may, I will challenge the question, because I don't think there is COVID catch-up funding for the early years. I think that is the point, that the COVID catch-up funding, inadequate or adequate or whatever you think about it, is absolutely not around the early years. And I think I think recognizing the importance of what's happened to babies in lockdown is a brilliant report that I think the Parent Internet Foundation produced a while back. But, you know, recognizing the damage that's happened to the developmental stage at those first 2 years for babies who, you know, might have had their first birthday and have spent their entire life in lockdown. I think that's absolutely critical. And I think we're not recognizing the importance of that, and also therefore implementing the kind of catch-up strategies required to stop those problems developing further as they move towards school.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it was a huge amount of funding, but it was part of the 700 million tranche in February.
18 million for a specific language program for 3 and 4 year olds. So nothing for under 2s. Sorry. I just make the point because I feel it.
Would anyone else like to come in on that one? Oh, Naomi, I think you're just on mute there. If you just unmute yourself.
Right. I completely agree with what Felicity said. I mean, I think there's something very subtle going on in that, you know, that first slide I did about reducing pressures, increasing capabilities. I think that neither the Blair government, the Brown government, or indeed the Cameron government were afraid of Nanny State. They were very, very interventionist in family policy. And I think the May government and the Johnson government are very non-interventionist in family policy. And I think the May government was non-interventionist because she didn't have children. And dare I say it, the Johnson government, he doesn't know how many he has. He absolutely will not talk about family policy because his position has always been this is a private matter. And I think the problem with early years is it's tied very much into family policy, not into education. So he can talk about schools, he can't talk about early years.
Thank you. And Zara, do you have any thoughts on that one?
So going back to this bit about what Felicity was saying about, there's not any funding for the sort of under threes. And I think that's a really important and thing to sort of discuss here. I mean, we have a provision here that starts with children as young as 2. And if I pinpoint on one thing directly, when I talk about the meals, nursery meals aren't free. They're not free for any child who's attending a nursery provision. But yet you go to primary school and then you have preschool meals for children in, Key Stage 1. Well, actually, what about these children who are as young as 2? We've talked a little bit about how the pandemic has sort of stopped a lot of services for families and children, and having we haven't been able to sort of keep an eye on those sort of early formative years for those children. They've missed out on quite a lot of support that they could have otherwise have had. But diet is just as important. So when we're looking at providing children with a great which might be that one meal a day, which could give them the nutrients that they need for the day, and parents struggling parents who, again, vulnerable twos who aren't able to afford to sort of pay for a school meal, those are really important things to think about. Funding for making sure that children at least have access to one meal a day that will help them with their sort of growth and development. So yes, I do think there's a lot more to be done in terms of government sort of providing access to funding for early years pupils.
Fantastic, thanks so much. And now we're going to move on to a Q&A with the audience. We've already had loads of questions submitted, so thanks very much. So the first question is from Toby Martlew from Ark Oval Primary Academy. And he asks, how has the scope and nature of the challenges in statutory education been affected by the changing landscape of non-statutory? So would anyone like to start us off there? Anyone? Maybe Zara, as a current practitioner? Is that one you've got any thoughts on?
Sorry, can you just repeat that question for me, please?
So the question is, how has the scope and nature of the challenges in statutory education been affected by the changing landscape of non-statutory?
Okay. So I guess obviously nursery is non-statutory education, which therefore means that children do not have to attend non-statutory education. They don't have to attend nursery. I think that in itself is challenging in itself, when you're trying to encourage children to attend on a regular basis, to enable them to develop a great start to their early years education. That can be challenging. I mentioned earlier when we were sort of first looking to begin ArkStart in October last year, growing a cohort of pupils that was very minimal. We started off with, I think, initially 17 pupils at our provision. As nursery is non-statutory, we were worried that children weren't actually going to attend, and as we know, an early years education provides that a strong foundation for future learning, and children should be in nursery or early years provision if they can be. And so I think that focusing on making sure that children do attend non-statutory provision and get the right start is very important. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you very much. And our next question is from Anna Brinkworth at Art Victoria. She says, how can we best tailor teaching for the new year 1 cohort, considering their disrupted nursery and reception experience? So would anyone like to speak about that? I'm thinking, Zara, this might be one for you again, just with your current expertise of, how children in your experience have fared over the past year.
Yeah, so I think children in early years have missed out on a lot. When we think about early years provision, the opportunity to experience the outdoors, and learn from the world around them, gain those those PSED skills of being able to manage their behaviors and self-regulate and build friendships and relationships, develop those early literacy skills, learning how to play with one another, developing their early math skills. All of that has sort of that time has sort of been taken away from them to some degree. And so those children going into year one, it's not to say that, I don't want to sort of use the term that they're at disadvantage, but what they have missed out on, we need to make sure that we cover and make up for in some way, shape or form. So a curriculum that is not entirely, I wouldn't say play based, but a curriculum that actually takes into consideration the sort of goals of the early years foundation stage, sort of encompassing that and working with that alongside the year one curriculum is probably going to be the best possible outcome. So really, really taking the knowledge of the early learning goals and thinking about how you can incorporate that into the year one curriculum, so that they work side by side, especially in the first term, in the first instance, is going to be a good way to start.
Thank you. And this next question really just leads on from what you were saying. This is from Chimezi Anekwe at Titsao Global School in Nigeria. This question is, should early years practitioners develop their own curriculum based on what they see fit? So has anyone got any thoughts on that one? Naomi, I think I saw you open your mouth.
Yeah. I think I was trying to figure this out because I think it's a mix. I think that you do need a curriculum structure, but I think one of the joys of early years should be that flexibility in following each child individually, and that the record keeping and the knowledge about the child will know that, gee, that kid spends all his time in the block corner. How do I pull him away and get him to do something different? How do you make sure that every child has opportunities for learning and all the key goals without having the kind of formal curriculum? So I think that we do need more flexibility. And I think that the more structured it is, the more, in my view, and this is why we need a trained workforce, is it's about not trusting the workforce. The more you tell people bit by bit by bit, do this, do this, do this, at this time, this time, it means that you don't trust in the professionalism of the front line. And when you do that, you de-skill the front line. So obviously it's a long time since I worked in a nursery, but there's real joy in it if you do have some flexibility. And to take that joy away really ruins the quality of what you're doing. I mean, young children are really fun. Not all of them, some of them are really difficult, but I do think that the more we specify, the more we're de-skilling the front line.
Thank you very much. I wanted
to add a little bit more onto that. So, I mean, something that we found, especially over the years, is that children learn best from learning from their own interests. So what we have is a curriculum here, especially at ArkStart, that sort of, it builds upon the children's interests. So when we're teaching, the communication and language and the math skills and those, the play in the construction area, we're looking at their interests and thinking, how can we, make sure that they learn those targets and achieve those goals, focusing on using their interests as a starting point. If you're interested in trucks, that's fantastic. How are we going to teach you how to build using with trucks in mind? How can we inspire you to write about trucks using your sort of your interests? So I think to answer that question to some degree, it's about taking children's interests and tailoring that again to your curriculum and thinking about how you can teach aspects of the curriculum using what they love and what they enjoy.
Thank you very much. And the next question is looking more broadly at sort of long-term policy. This is from Richard Jewell, CEO of Team SOS. He asks, if you could write this script for a bipartisan early years policy consensus that would last a decade, what would it say? Felicity, do you want to come in there?
I can just repeat, if I could write the bipartisan
early years policy. that would, if you could write up an early years policy that would last 10 years, what would it say? Like a 10-year policy for early years.
Right, well, how long have we got? Only 20 minutes. Oh dear, that's not good enough. Well, I'd do a few things. The first thing I'd do is I'd put the basics of early childhood development into the school curriculum so that everyone who becomes a parent has at least some background, baseline knowledge, even if they've forgotten 80% of it, there's something there. The second thing I would do is I would reform Whitehall and the local authority structure so that early years, instead of being 0 to 2, it's a health issue, 3 to 5, it's an education issue, and everything falls apart, it falls in the middle. I would structure all the policy making and the funding into a single early years unit, probably in the Cabinet Office, to take it away from any of those government departments getting sort of angsty about it. And I would focus on the 0 to 5 period of development as a sort of single phase. And then I would fundamentally restructure the funding model. I mean, there's just so many things to say about this. I would restructure the funding model around the paying of people who work in the early years to reflect the requirements of the professional requirements that you have in schools. I would change the pupil premium so that it's at least the same as schools, probably higher. I would focus funding much more closely on those that need it the most, on the families that need it the most. So getting away from just universal more money, because let's face it, there isn't more money endlessly. Once COVID's over, we're going to have to realize that. So I would be much more the universal plus model. I would focus much more on the plus away from the universal. I would focus on around the training and the recognition of the staffing model, so that going to the point about Naomi said about the curriculum, the last question around the curriculum. Yes, you want some curriculum, but you don't want to de-skill the workforce by telling them what to do. I agree completely. You need to be led by the child, but at the same time, you need to ensure that the workforce is skilled in order to be able to do that. So yeah, is that a starter? I'm sure the others can add lots more.
Yeah, this is rather depressing because I did write it.
Oh, God.
And it came out in 2004. I didn't write it. I have to say that. That's very arrogant of me. A team at the Department of Education and the Department of Health, working with Number 10 and working with the Treasury, a jointly published document, 10-year childcare strategy, choice for parents to best start for children. Now, there were some key elements in that. One of them was 3,500 children's centers that we did. One of the elements in it that was really important, which I mean, there were some things I disagree with what Felicity said, but basically I agree with most of what she said. I don't believe in the reorganization of government. It never works. It just moves the deck chairs around the Titanic. It just doesn't work. You just have to put it somewhere and let them get on with it. But the one thing that was missing is what we really wanted in the 10-year strategy that we never got was 1 year paid maternity paternity leave at minimum wage. Now, I know this is counterintuitive. I agree with Felicity about targeting, but I believe in area targeting, not individual families. I believe you put your money in your poorest areas and then you have open access to services. And the other thing that we did in the 10-year strategy that worked and we had really great evidence for it was a graduate leader fund, so that we were investing in graduates and we were scoping the quality that followed investing in graduates. So the one bit that I disagree with is the evidence on education about young children in secondary schools affecting parenting is zero. I mean, I think everyone should learn about child development. I really think everyone should learn about child development, including brain development, but because not everyone's going to be a parent. But the evidence on parenting education is pretty nil. And basically, it doesn't have meaning for you until you become one. And I say that from both vast experience with other parents, but also myself. But yes to part of the curriculum being child development.
Thank you. And our next question is from Samantha Cream, who is Director of Business Development at London Early Years Foundation. And she is asking, how can we encourage the government to support provision in areas of disadvantage and incentivize qualified staff to work in the specific areas that need it most? And she has some statistics showing that in London, the number of nurseries has increased over the past 2 years, but the number in the most deprived areas has gone down by 12%. So clearly an issue of making sure that the things are being targeted towards the areas that need it most. Does anyone have any thoughts on that one?
I'm sorry, I'm going to jump in again because I have a really funny answer that will show how old I am. I was a teenager during the Vietnam War, and teachers got out of the draft if they worked in Bedford-Stuyvesant. So instead of, you didn't have to be in the army if you worked in a really poor area as a teacher, which I think is hilarious in terms of incentivizing. But the other thing that very few people know about is that for high scope, which was the model on all this and all the cost benefit analysis that Felicity talked about was based on high scope, teachers at high scope got paid more. They got paid a premium to work in that area. And I'm sorry that, incentives work. I have no problem with paying people more to work in areas where it's very, that's how business works. If you have a dearth of staff, you pay more to attract better staff. So I just think that you need a better incentive system.
Thank you very much. And another question is something we touched on briefly earlier, but just to pick it up in more detail. One of the attendees is asking that some of the challenges we see in early years is that it's quite fragmented across health, education, etc. Schools are an easy vehicle for spending money on children, but where should the money go for early years? So who'd like to answer that? Felicity?
I just want to push back on something Naomi said about changing Whitehall never changes it. I actually disagree, because I think when you've got policy and funding spread across 14 government departments and NDPBs, you literally have no chance. You have no chance of creating any kind of cohesion. And I think if you did bring it all together in a way that with schools, having worked in schools policy for 20 years, it's so much easier when you have this thing called a school to deal with. So everything you want to talk about that happens in a school, you deal with the entity of the school. The trouble with early years is it's so fragmented that I think if I really do believe it would make a difference. Apart from anything else, the way that civil servants operate, and Naomi's experienced this, is that they all have ministers with KPIs, with ministerial priorities. That they're very blinkered about achieving what their minister sets them to achieve. If you've got 8 different ministers with 8 different sets of priorities, 8 different calendar years, and all of that, you are not going to get the best, most integrated, most streamlined, sensible, data sharing, data rich system from 0 to 5. You're just not. And so I actually do think that if you're going to spend the money, you want to spend the money, all the things that Naomi has said about the 10-year strategy, I sort of agree with in terms of where you spend the money. But I think if you are fragmenting the processing of it into so many different streams, both nationally and locally, you're fragmenting service access for families and in the localities, but you're also wasting so much money because you're replicating teams, you're replicating processes across Whitehall. And I think it's mad.
We'll have to take it offline.
Okay.
All right, well, thanks very much. Good to have the differing views and experiences of working in government there. We're running out of time, but just to go through one more question. So this one is from Sarah Wilson, who's asking or setting the scene by saying that over 1,000 nurseries have closed over the last 6 months, and previous trends and knowledge of the impact of COVID suggests many of these will be in deprived areas. Combine this with the closures of maintained nurseries through lack of funding, and there will be a serious need for high quality early years provision in these places. So the question is, how can we persuade nurseries to open in these areas when the funding makes opening a new nursery so undesirable? Would anyone like to start us off there? Naomi, was that you?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same argument. You persuade people by giving them the money to do it. I mean, we didn't have a problem to persuade people to set up a Sure Start program. We just gave them loads of money. And the problem is that, we don't have money for everything. There is no magic money tree, et cetera, et cetera. There are priorities in government. And right now, early years is not a priority in government. We have to change that argument. We have to change that argument because, you can't persuade people to do it unless they, why would they do it? How would they do it?
I think what we have to do fundamentally is shift the dial of government focus and prioritization away from late intervention to early prevention. So at the moment, they all run around when, knife crime, it's a huge issue. But of course, the way to deal with knife crime is to deal with all the underlying issues that have put kids in gangs and given them that sense of, it's about addressing the issues that become symptoms of a problem later on, addressing them much earlier. And the early years, it seems to me, all the data, everything we understand about the impact of high quality early years provision on later life chances and later development says that if you just invest it earlier, it costs less. So yes, on the one hand, it's difficult because it sounds like the early years constantly going to government with cap in hand saying more money, more money. But at the same time, actually, the money is, we're not asking for more money, we're just shifting the money from downstream to sort of stop the problems before they really develop into something hideous.
Thank you so much. And we're now really just coming to the end of time, unfortunately, but it's been such a fascinating discussion talking about some of the long-term trends in early years policy, looking forward to the future and how the pandemic might influence things. I just wondered if each of our panelists could give us their closing thoughts in a couple of sentences, if that's all right, just to reflect on some of the themes we've heard today. Naomi, would you like to begin?
Sure. Just to say, I think every stage in life is important, and I think early intervention counts for every stage in life. And in the work I'm doing now in the NHS, we're very concerned about frail elderly. Well, the thing to do is to invest in better, falls prevention, better foot care, better eye care. There are things that stop people becoming frail elderly, which would save us lots of money. It doesn't save us enough money because then they're going to live longer, but they'll live longer in better health. So at every stage of life, there is an opportunity for early intervention in terms of what the future risks are. And we need to think through every stage of life in terms of early intervention and in terms of how we target those most at risk of the next downturn. So that would be my last thing. And my last one would be higher tax.
Thank you very much, Naomi. And Felicity, what are your final thoughts?
For people of my age.
Felicity, would you like to?
Yeah, I guess I feel this issue around how we change the conversation. So it's not just a discussion about increments. Do we have 2% more here and 1% less there? How we shift that needle from late intervention to early prevention. And I really do think as a society, it's down to all of us. We all need to be better educated about why the early years has such a profound impact later on and why it really matters. Not just to people who have small children, but to people who have no children but pay tax, to people who have adult children and think it's not their problem anymore but pay tax. And I just think that the way to engage with the political kind of decision-making class is to make them feel that there is a sense of a burning platform on this issue, that the voting public really care about it and that we're watching what they're doing and that it's not okay to call children's COVID catch-up requirements something that starts at 5 because it overlooks this, and as long as we frankly let them get away with it, they will continue as they do because what they think we care about is GCSE grades and which I'm not for one second saying are not important, but that's the language by which we measure and judge our decision makers. And I think that collectively we all need to focus on the issue of the early years in a more direct and frankly angry. I feel, I think we all need to sort of be a bit more angry about it because it's not okay.
Thanks very much, Felicity. And Zara, finally, what are your closing thoughts on today's discussion?
Oh, I have a lot of thoughts. I'm thinking holistically when I think about where the money should go in early years. I mean, I guess personally, I'm thinking about what we're doing and what we're trying to achieve here at ArkStart. And, you know, where we talk about being so much more than childcare, i.e. being not just a nursery where we're providing an education, we want to be a one-stop shop for everything that a family needs to be able to raise a child successfully. So when we're talking about health, we want to be able to signpost people, you know, our families to health, or have a health visitor that's, you know, a part of our provision. We want to make sure that we're able to, you know, if a child, you know, has dental issues, we want to be able to signpost parents, or maybe have a visiting dentist. We want to be able to make sure that we are well equipped to support families with everything regarding their child's upbringing and you know, their early years education right up until they start primary school. You know, when they start primary school, they have a health visitor visiting, they have some come away the children, you know, there's you know, you have an optician come and see if the children can see. Well, actually, why don't we have that in early years provisions? Why don't we have that, you know, for children as young as 2 and 3 who sometimes start not being able to talk in a full sentence? You know, why does it take so long for children, for you know, practitioners sometimes to realize that children have, you know, come to early years settings with you know, issues that could have been identified earlier? It's really important that, you know, if early years provisions are the first port of call for parental support, in terms of recognizing, you know, early identifiable concerns with children, that we are well equipped with the support that we can give to them to enable those children to have a great start.
Thank you so much, Zara, and thank you to all of our panelists for such a lively and informative discussion. Thank you to all our audience members for attending, and I look forward to seeing you all at the next ArkTalks event. Thank you very much.